Good morning. I'm Sue Berg with the Monroe County Purdue Extension Service here in Bloomington, and today we're going to be talking about putting food by. We have lots of potential for foods in the gardens and at the farmers market and at the various pantries, and so we're trying to show you ways of stretching your food dollar and making. And so with me today is a special guest, and Stephanie, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Solomon. I'm the Assistant Director of Mother Hubbard's Cupboard. I work with the Garden and Nutrition Program. We like to really have the resources to show our clients that it is possible to grow your own food and preserve it and really save some money, but also get involved in these great food traditions and food cultures. So I'm so excited to be with Sue today to go over the basics.
Okay. And I think probably one of the first things we want to think about is what do we put it into? And I have canning jars here to show you, Stephanie, that we can use the regular canning jars. One of the main things we need to remember to do is to always check, especially if you buy them at garage sales or someone gives you a bag of them, to take your finger and run it across the top of it to make sure it's nice and smooth. Because if there's a chip in it, it means there won't be a proper seal. And then your food that you've put into it will spoil. So save the chip jars for things like macaroni or putting sugar in it or things that don't spoil. And then the other part of that we need to think about is that we always want to use a lid that has a rubber gasket on it. And the rubber gasket is such that you need to warm that up in warm water when you get ready to can, and then you put that on top of your jar lid. Your jar lid goes on top of the jar itself, and making sure that this is clean, this is warm, and then we use what we call a canning jar ring that then we screw onto the lid as just hand tight, not so tight that you can't get it back off again. And that's the simple way to do it. We have the regular lid, and then we have also the wide mouth, which is great for things like peaches, sliced peaches or pears, or something that are going to have larger pieces in them. Tomatoes work great here if you're using stewed tomatoes. You'd reheat the lid. And one of the things we need to remember is that the lids are one-time use only. So this piece has to be replaced every time you use the new jar. The jars you can use forever, as long as they're not chipped. And a lot of people ask, well, can I use mayonnaise jars? Yes, you can, as long as the top of the edge is nice and smooth and that they fit exactly with the lid and that the threading of the top of the jar will match the top of the ring.
So I can't just go out and use, any tomato sauce jar that's left
you don't really
over.
want to use tomato juice jars because they weren't built for multiple use. You'll notice that on these kinds of jars, we have a heavy glass ring, thick glass at the bottom, and then it's domed in the very center of it. And what that does is when it's in the hot water, it allows for the heat to come up the sides and not heat just the bottom, which would cause it to break. And so a lot of your mayonnaise jars or your spaghetti sauce or large jelly jars, things like that you'd think, well, they're glass jars, the lids fit, I can use them. You need to check to make sure there's a dome in the bottom of them so that the heat will come up the sides of the jar as it's being heated in the canner.
So don't use it if it doesn't have a dome on the bottom.
Right, and doesn't have a nice thick glass on it.
Great.
And it's much better to put it in a jar that's going to work than to put it in a jar to try to save money, and then when you get it to take it out of the canner and you lift it up and there's the empty jar and all your food is in the bottom because the bottom broke out.
That's a very disappointing feeling, I know from experience.
It's not fun at all. So jars are very important when you're working with canning, and particularly as you're doing either water bath or pressure canning. And so that's one of the first things you need to have. Secondly, there's a lot of pots and pans that you can use, and we'll show them to you later. But you don't have to have a lot of equipment to be able to can. If you've got a good size stock pot and you've got some pot holders and your glass jars, your lids and your rings and some good quality food, you're ready to go.
So you don't have to have a pressure canner to do certain kinds of canning?
No, you sure don't. You can use what we call hot water bath. And most of those are done with anything that we call high acid food. That would be tomatoes and any kind of fruit. Peaches, pears, apples, applesauce, grapes, all of those kinds of things any fruit, along with tomatoes, which botanically is a fruit,
right,
that those can be done in a hot water bath. So if you've got a big stock pot and a heat-proof plate, you can do it without buying any extra equipment at all.
That's great.
So you don't have to put a lot of money into it. Now, there are gadgets that are fun to have and nice to have if you're really a dedicated canner. And being that I'm one of those probably unusual people, is I get a thrill when I can have a whole line of canned jars on in my pantry. And especially when I'm canning itself, when I hear that ding as the cans seal, that I just get a big thrill out of it. But I'm sure others would say, boy, she is probably a really weird duck on that part, but I enjoy it. So,
me too.
But one of the things that I find to be really handy is a jar filler. These you can buy at the hardware store. Sometimes you can get them in garage sales, because as people get older and don't need as much food put by, or they're tired of it, you may find these. They last forever. And what happens is that what's nice about this, it's like a funnel. And so when you put it in the jar, it fits perfectly in the jar, so that you can dump your food into the jar and pack it and not have it spill out all over the counter and make a mess.
And that works with the wide jars.
It sure does. It works with both types of jars. It just fits in a little bit deeper, so it's great, especially if you're doing applesauce or peach sauce or anything like that, where it's syrupy. Spaghetti sauce, salsa, those kinds of things. So this is a great piece to have. Another one is a great finger saver.
Yes.
is the jar tongs. And these look rather strange, but what they are is that they're shaped so that you can pick up the jar under the ridge out of the hot water bath and pick it up and move it over and put it onto some newspaper to cool. But what we quite often do is we take a hot pad and we take the can out of the jar, out of the canner, and in doing so we put it hot pad down like this, and the water's up above the canning jar, and next thing we know our hot pad's wet, and hot water and wet hot pads and fingers don't match.
Right.
And so it's very difficult then to move it over. But when you have the canning jar tongs, they fit very nicely on here, and you can actually carry these around the kitchen, and as long as you keep them tight, you can carry them anywhere, and you're not going to end up dropping them and burning your fingers. And so safety is another personal safety as well as food safety are very important when we're canning.
Making sure we don't crack jars or burn ourselves.
Exactly. And so that it's important that we follow some safety rules for our own personal body, but also what we're trying to make sure that we do is to be sure that we can safely, so that people will not get sick from our canning. Because botulism is something that's very common in home canning, and that's why we can't bring home canned products to the pantry, because we don't know how it was processed.
Right.
And so that many of us may have some extras at the end of the year, like extra canned tomatoes, and knowing that the new tomatoes are coming on quickly, and we don't want to toss them out, obviously, but at the food pantries and at the community kitchen and so on, we just can't allow home canned products to be brought in as donations.
Right.
And so try to plan your use of your products so that you can get them used up during the year. They will last for probably 3 years, as long as you keep them in a cool, dark place.
I think it makes sense too to think about what you're actually going to use.
Exactly.
Sometimes you get excited about canning, and then
exactly,
you're like, what am I going to do with this can of okra? You know?
Exactly, especially if you decide that okra or Brussels sprouts aren't your cup of tea.
Right.
And when I came in this morning, I had a library patron say to me, "No, are you going to can Brussels sprouts?" And that's the only vegetable I really have a hard time eating.
Really? It's my favorite.
Oh, and I can eat all the other cabbage part of the family, but for some reason those little Brussels sprouts...
Even straight from the garden?
Even straight from the garden. Wow. So I don't grow them in my garden. I grow okra, but I don't grow Brussels sprouts. But this morning I'd like to share with you the way to make peaches. But first, tomatoes are something that we can can. These were ones we canned in a food workshop last fall, and you can see they've stayed nice and bright and red.
They're beautiful.
And then, but one of the things we need to remember is that you need to fill the jar properly. This was one that I knew wasn't going to work, but I knew I was going to have to need it for a program. So this is one that we didn't quite fill up to the first ridge,